I call the regular meeting of the City of Ashland Planning Commission to order for April 14th, 2026. I will note that our meetings are available on Zoom. Thank you very much. Just to be official, I'll note that our meetings are available on Zoom and on RVTV. The public can find information on how to participate in Planning Commission meetings in our public notices, as well as directions on how to find the full meeting materials, applications, and staff reports. And I note that we have 7 of 7 planning commissioners present, so we do have a quorum. Welcome, Russell. Staff announcements, Brandon.
Thank you, Chair Werner. A couple things to note is the city office hours at community development have changed. They are now 9 to 1 o'clock, Monday through Thursday, and from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. Currently in the community center, administration has walk-in hours as well. I lost my notes, but other updates, this month is Fair Housing Month, and the City of Ashland is sponsored collaboratively with Fair Housing Council of Oregon and Oregon Shakespeare Festival to promote fair housing. And if any of you have an opportunity to go see a play between now and April 20th, there's a display board that highlights discrimination within Oregon historically related to fair housing. Additionally, the Perosi Fountain was removed. It will be returning, but it is the last major step before restoration begins, and my understanding is carving of that fountain is to begin shortly. So those are some immediate updates. I also wanted to note that as type 1 planning approvals, the city staff did approve for the renovation of the property at the corner of A Street and First, across the street from the co-op. The former automotive place is now going to be turning into a food and outdoor seating area. So that project now has planning approvals, but it's probably still a year away before we actually will have a place to go eat. So that's about it.
It's cool, it's coming. Okay, we have a consent agenda for approval of March 10th, 2026 regular meeting minutes. Would somebody like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second?
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Okay, all those opposed? Motion passed. Public forum, I do not see anybody out there, so we're going to skip over that. Our unfinished business this evening is approval of findings for PA-T2-2026-00066, which was a request for concurrent outline and final plan approval for a 4-lot performance standards option, or PSO, subdivision, and it included a request for residential site design review approval and for a tree removal permit. This property is Area 7 of Kestrel Park, Phase 3, at the corner of Nandina Street and Mountain Meadows Drive. We had a public hearing and voted to approve this on March 10th, 2026. And I will ask if any of the commissioners have had any ex parte contact since then. Commissioner Herron?
No ex parte, but I want to abstain from voting due to potential business conflicts with the applicant.
Okay. Commissioner Kincairn?
I did not, I worked on that project. I can't vote on it.
Oh, okay. Commissioner Lininger?
No ex parte contact.
Commissioner McCracken-Jen?
No ex parte contact. Did drive by it because you have to.
Commissioner Marr?
No ex parte.
Commissioner Phillips?
No ex parte.
And I have not had any ex parte contact either. So we will begin deliberations. Does anybody have any questions about the staff or the report that's in front of us? The draft findings? If not, Russell?
Yeah, just a quick question on the tree removal. I saw that it was listed, but there was no condition for it. Is that something that we should add a condition for?
If you feel it's necessary, you could certainly add a condition. Given that it's only one tree, I think the landscaping that they'll be doing will more than cover any mitigation requirement. And it's also so prominent on that hillside that there's no chance of mistaking it for another tree and needing a tree verification.
Perfect. That sounds good to me.
Okay.
Okay, would somebody like to make a motion? Either to approve or to deny? You get to pick?
Sure, I'll do something different.
Sure.
I make a motion to approve. Do I need to say more than that?
Nope.
Okay.
Would somebody like to second?
Second.
We have a motion to approve the PA-T2-2026-00066. Findings, approval of findings. Michael, will you call the roll?
Commissioner Phillips,
Yes.
Commissioner Marr,
Yes.
Commissioner McCracken-Jones,
Yes.
Commissioner Leininger,
Yes.
Chair Werner.
Yes. Okay, the motion passes. Thank you very much for the action of the evening. We'll now move on to discussion items, which is a discussion of legislative updates in response to state requirements. And staff is looking to us for advice on zone change, on 4 areas of these updates. One is zone changes or upzones. Second is performance standards, options, subdivisions. The third is variances. And the fourth is design standards for subdivisions. Derek?
Okay. Talking about Senate Bill 974, which is all housing. I have pictures interspersed through here, just so it's not a bunch of words. So 974 is essentially looking to remove procedural impediments to housing production. The required amendments include a 120-day shot clock, similar to the 120-day clock you're all familiar with for land use, but now applying that to engineering plan review as well. So once a land use approval is granted and the applicant prepares and submits civil drawings, the engineering division will have 120 days to review and make a decision on those, just like the land use process. And again, as Chair Werner mentioned, the other areas where this applies would be removing public hearing requirements for upzones, for planned unit developments, and variances, as well as looking at some changes to design standard applicability to 1 and 2 family dwelling projects with more than 20 lots being created. So I'll go through those individually, looking for some feedback from you all in terms of preferences on our approach. Just so you're aware, we're also working with the Rogue Valley Council of Governments and looking at regionally going through all of our land use codes in the region to identify where we can make them more clear and objective to comply with state requirements. That parallel process happening with the Council of Governments is underway now, but not scheduled for completion until next July. The changes here that we have to do for 974 are supposed to be adopted by July of this year. So again, the first issue, in terms of the 120-day shot clock for engineering reviews, is not something that's contained within the land use ordinance. We've been in discussions with the engineering division, and they haven't raised any concerns. And it doesn't appear that there's any land use changes necessary to comply with that requirement. So really nothing for you here. In your packet, we've included this roadmap, which is based on a roadmap graciously provided to us by City of Medford. Sort of illustrates our current codes within each of the areas of requirement under 974, and then some options for approaching each one, as well as things to think about. And I'll just sort of go through each of these one at a time. The first being zone changes to increase residential density. Our current code requires that we have a type 3 legislative public hearing before the Planning Commission and Council and adopt any changes by ordinance as is required under ORS 227186. We do have some limited provisions in our code that allow property-specific zone changes to be processed as a type 2, which is a Planning Commission decision through a public hearing, but we haven't ever implemented those requirements because the state law under 227186 still requires any kind of alteration to zoning to be processed through an ordinance, which requires a public hearing at council. So 974 is saying that any request for a zone change to increase residential zoning, and that would include both residential property and mixed-use property with residential, would have to be handled as a staff decision, a type 1, with a decision by the staff advisor and no requirement for a public hearing unless somebody filed an appeal to the Planning Commission. So I think in looking at the options for this, staff believe the first option would be to essentially comply with 974 and make it clear in the code that any upzones that qualify as an urban housing application, which is something we'll have to define clearly in the code, could be processed as a type 1 staff decision with all other procedures for zone changes to remain as they are. That doesn't address the conflict with ORS 227186, where it requires public notice, a public hearing, and adoption by ordinance. So the second option would be to retain all of our current regulations, not adopt changes that are going to conflict with ORS 227186, and wait for some resolution from the state on that conflicting issue. I think we've been in ongoing heavy communication with them and not received kind of a clear answer other than model codes and rulemaking are due early next year. And they're not willing to give us any kind of clear advice until after rulemaking is adopted. So, I mean, that kind of first issue is looking at whether you all want to make changes and allow upzoning as a type 1 staff decision or wait until the rulemaking resolves that conflict. And I don't know if you want to do these discussion or wait till the end and go through them.
We might as well do them individually.
Okay.
So,
If it helps, there's the 227 that details out the requirements.
so why wouldn't we wait?
I mean, I don't know what Brandon will say. My advice probably would be that we should wait.
Yeah.
You know, my advice in terms of zone changes, because we have a conflict that if we abide by 974 and do not require a hearing, we simultaneously violate ORS 227. And so I think that would be vulnerable to challenge by somebody that felt that they needed an opportunity to be heard. In the interest of public engagement, I would err on the side of providing a public hearing opportunity, because then people haven't lost that opportunity by an approval standard. However, that is in direct conflict with 974. So an applicant could make an argument that by requiring a public hearing, the city is in violation of 974. Outlining this to the state as a mutually conflicting requirement, they said they acknowledged that that was something that was recognized before the legislation was passed, but was not addressed. And they will be addressing it through rulemaking, which is to kick off this summer with no resolution until they have a model code after the new year.
So again, why wouldn't we wait until they do that?
That's my advice, but it does leave the city in a position that should an applicant feel that 974, which goes into effect on July 1st, if our process requires a public hearing for upzoning for residential,
Then it's in conflict.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So if I recall correctly, last time we discussed this, the practical reality of this bill or modification is that anybody who had any concern with a particular petition or application could simply appeal, and then would have to go back to hearing anyways. Is that correct?
Yeah, if staff made a decision to approve or deny,
Yeah.
an applicant or a neighbor could appeal that decision to the planning commission. That would then be the final decision of the city. And so that is different than a type 2 action where it goes to the planning commission for a hearing and that appeal then goes to the city council.
Right.
So that's one difference.
So the basis to wait is essentially a bet or risk mitigation strategy that someone in the interim, the next, whatever,
6 months.
6 months, is going to raise a hand and say, this is,
And again, I'm of
discriminatory
the
in some
opinion
way.
that they can raise a hand from either side.
right.
So
Right.
I don't think it alleviates that conflict, regardless of which one you move forward with. From a staff recommendation, it would largely be to support a public process and a public hearing before the planning commission.
I'll just make one last statement and be quiet. I would say
Promise.
that the risk, I promise, the risk, that we're better off waiting. There's a conflict. You can just make the argument that there was a conflict, so we decided to wait.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think waiting is our better option, because I'd rather have somebody say that we're violating 974 than saying we're violating our own current standards.
Yes.
Susan?
So I generally agree, but are we aware of any imminent applications that might be, critical to be able to address while we're sort of in this holding pattern?
Derek might be able to answer better than I. I'm not familiar with any specific application for upzoning residential property that has gone through a pre-app recently. The one application that comes to mind is the Croman development. However, that is a full legislative master plan with quite a few other elements, and I don't think it falls into this urban housing application definition.
Right. So it's
We
not
have-
like we would be blocking something.
I have
Critical.
been told by a developer that they're holding at least one upzoning application in anticipation of this change. But again, they haven't done a pre-app, so, and they haven't told me what property, so it could very well have just been flippant.
I mean, the irony would be if this is an intent to simplify and enable, and it ends up blocking progress in the short term, that's, what
I
I'm
would-
trying to explore.
Try and clarify that in no case would I consider it blocking an application. An applicant could still apply for a zone change, but they would be subject to the hearing process before the planning commission. And if it met the criteria of approval, theoretically that would be approved.
Okay, so it would be BAU until
I don't know the acronym.
business as usual,
Thank you.
until there is
Correct.
a resolution.
Yeah.
Russell, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Werner. I'm going to be speaking from the minority here, but my feeling would be since 974 did pass and the intent is to simplify and move towards fewer procedural hurdles and administrative review of the zone changes, that we might investigate a legally defensible pathway that preserves the ordinance adoption requirements for making this still an initial decision administratively consistent with SB 974. And so that's my thought, since these did pass, that we start moving towards the change sooner rather than later for these.
Okay, thank you. Jay?
Thank you. Just to briefly respond to Russell's comment, which I really appreciate, about the intent of 974. The legislature nonetheless put us in between a rock and a hard place here, because 974 did not repeal or overwrite ORS 227.186. So there is a conflict of law between 227 and chapter 197A, which is what that bill amended. Because that conflict of law exists, I think we're better off waiting for the OLCD to interpret those laws and attempt to harmonize them through rulemaking, or else allow the LUBA or an Oregon court to interpret that conflict, rather than going out on a limb as a planning commission or as a city to interpret how to harmonize those two laws, where we could end up back in the same place where we are now.
The other thing I'll say is that they are aware of the problem, and they are putting somebody on writing a draft ordinance for city use. I know it isn't gonna be quick, and supposedly, and they're telling us that it'll come into effect after, 6 months after we're supposed to have adopted something, but I still think it makes sense to wait.
And they have also indicated they don't know if it will address the conflict or not.
Is that our state government at work?
But like Jay said, a court will.
Right.
I mean, they're being flippant, but there is a simple solution that gets through it. Is we would just deny every application at staff level and make the applicant ask for a hearing. And then,
You don't want that reputation.
no. But that's really the only way that you could meet both.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, is that enough guidance?
Yes. Second one has to do with planned unit developments, which we really don't have a specific planned unit development process, but our performance standards option is generally largely similar. So that's really what we would be looking at addressing this through. Currently, we have a two-step review process, as you all know. Outline plan approval before the Planning Commission as a type 2 with the potential for appeal to council, and then a final plan approval as a staff decision with appeal to the Planning Commission. And where outline and final plan are addressing developments of 10 lots or less, it's a single Planning Commission decision with appeal to council. The options would really be taking literally what 974 requires and identifying all subdivisions that are performance standard subdivisions that are an urban housing application and making those type 1 and having any non-residential subdivisions remain a type 2 under the current procedure. Or we could simply, to simplify things, have all subdivisions, period, become a type 1 subject to appeal to Planning Commission. And you may also want to consider, as we talk about this, do we want to retain the two-tiered outline and final plan process for performance standards subdivisions? And I think probably we do, but it's something maybe worth talking about. And also, the trigger point, 10 lots for allowing concurrent review. You may want to look at modifying that while we're doing this. Currently, we have a limit of 12 units in a cottage housing development and a 10-unit cap for concurrent review. At least bringing it up to a 12-unit cap would mean that cottage housing developments wouldn't have that procedural impediment.
Carrie?
So one of the benefits, I think, of outline plan and final plan is that the applicant, even though they may think they already know all the answers and have done everything they need to do, it creates a process by which you can find out where things aren't going to go well. I think it's really helpful. So I don't think it does anybody any favors, even though it makes it faster. It doesn't do anybody any favors to do away with that, in my experience. So I just wanted to,
So you're suggesting to not
keeping the
combine.
final and outline as two separate entities for anything, I guess you could change it to anything over 12 units.
Okay.
Yeah.
It seems to me most of the PSOs that we've looked at recently have been a combined final plan and outline and final plan. Is that because they're on the small side?
They're smaller, and I think that may be why they get done as multiple lots instead of a single. That's not true.
I know a recent development, the Grand Terrace, specifically designed their project to come in under the 10 threshold to process outline and final plan at the same time to reduce their application timeline and also reduce the opportunity for subsequent appeals.
Okay, so they played the system.
Yeah, again, that works for a multifamily development on multiple lots. A 20-unit subdivision for single family would be in a position to go through outline and final plan. They could not condense it to 10 lots and have 20 independent lots for sale.
So, and this is totally a sidetrack, sorry. But from a complication standpoint of doing a development, if you think about the circulation and everything else, single-family residential, 20 units is an easier design process than multifamily on 4 lots or whatever. So it seems like it's kind of backwards. So I'm just trying to complicate things more or switch the complication.
I don't know if this adds to the discussion, but one value of having an outline plan review, I think for the applicant, is that they have their approval before costing out all the engineering for doing the final plan. An applicant coming forward with outline and final plan simultaneously may have conditions that modify work that was already done at some expense. However, under this PSO subdivision under 974, they could either be done concurrent or independent as we have in our code now. In both cases, they would be an administrative approval so that they would not be coming to the Planning Commission for review and approval for residential urban housing application subdivisions.
So I thought there was a size limit, and anything over a certain size comes to Planning Commission.
No, the size limit that we were talking about are 10 or 12.
No, I get that
Okay.
for
The
this.
20 units distinction is, you can't apply, for single and two-family, you can't apply design standards for more than 20 lots. But there's not a limit on, I mean, you can have a 100 lot subdivision and still have it be a staff level decision. But a 10 unit or a 10 unit multifamily building would have the type 2.
That 20 number, that comes from section.
I believe so.
The 10 and 12 distinction, that was a manuscript.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a reason why we would cap it at 12 and not go up to 19?
I think as you increase the number of lots, and people at the table might be able to better answer than I, but as you increase the number of lots, you get into more complexity. And I think the thought was at a smaller subdivision level, it would be easier to estimate the civil improvement requirements, but as you get into more lots, more units, more infrastructure, there's more likely to be some alteration between the outline and final plan.
I mean, that would be true of a change from 10 to 12 as well. And so I'm just trying to understand what the value added would be of an incremental change
Yeah.
from X to Y to Z.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 10 to 12 is strictly because we currently have a process that allows you to do 12 units of cottage housing, and 10 units of cottage housing would be a concurrent review, but 2 more 800 square foot units would trigger a 2-tier process.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
But I mean, I do think there's valid consideration to think of, is that appropriate number 20 or?
For the purpose of cottage housing, it certainly does seem appropriate. Okay.
So-
I have another question, if I could.
Can I,
Go ahead.
while we're still on this, so I just want to double check in the scenario that, Brandon, that you were posing, if there's a, if staff approves a original plan of, that would still come to us on appeal. It wouldn't,
Yes.
okay.
I think there is a provision that it could, was it for a major type 3 change and appeal goes straight to LUBA?
I think you have the option to adopt a procedure to just say staff decision and any appeals are to LUBA, which cuts out a local public process and
Totally.
makes what public process remains, I think, a lot less friendly to somebody interested in appealing and would discourage public participation.
Yeah, and it also violates goal 1
Yeah.
of the,
So that may be an area for this commission to advise of whether you'd like to see appeals of staff decisions come to the planning commission or have staff be the final decision of the city.
okay. So my preference would be to have decisions come back to the planning commission, or appeals come back to the planning commission.
To us, yeah. Otherwise,
Why are we here?
why are we here?
Other than to talk about changes to the code. Okay, Jay, you had another question?
Yeah, thank you. Regarding the options for amendment, it seems to me like maintaining a distinction of residential and non-residential makes a lot of sense because SB 974 deals with urban housing applications. It's residential. If we were to group residential and non-residential into a similar procedure, that would reach beyond the scope of the new law. And I think it would preclude us from processing any change to the land use ordinance under ORS 197.216, which allows us to make that change with notice to OLCD, but without a public hearing. If we were to include non-residential in the scope of this kind of amendment, then that would require a public hearing. And it would be kind of a whole extra legislative process that this new law is not requiring us to undertake. So amendment option 1 there makes the most sense to me. I mean, the council certainly can direct us to undertake option 2, but I wouldn't want to initiate it here unless council does that. And so that's the first thought. The second thought that I have about this PSO subdivisions matter is that there's a lot of ambiguity in this new law. And it's not clear to me what exactly an initial decision is. Section 3.7 of SB 974 provides in the first sentence that the initial decision on the urban housing application must be made without a hearing. And that's the part of this new bill that seems to be causing the most heartburn in terms of communication with state agencies. Does the new law, or does any other part of Oregon revised statutes, or does any administrative rule define an initial decision as that phrase is used in section 3.7? It's a question. I don't think it does. Because it does not define what that initial decision is, it's ambiguous, right? And so it's up to state rulemaking or the courts or us to interpret the meaning of that phrase. In the absence of a state rule or any court decision on the matter, it's our job to figure out what an initial decision is going to be in our land use code. The same section, 3.7, provides in the second sentence, a local government may provide for a hearing on appeal of the initial decision. We've been alluding to that, right? But a hearing on appeal of the initial decision also is undefined in the law and presumably will be interpreted through rulemaking. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The third and fourth sentences of section 3.7 in SB 974 allows local government to choose the form of a hearing on appeal of the initial decision. And it offers a couple of options. It could be a closed record hearing, or it could be an ORS 197 hearing like we do in a type 2 review, right? Now, the law also makes a distinction between an initial decision and a final decision. There are two places in the bill where it talks about a final decision without defining that phrase, right? And those occur in section 3.7 itself, the third and fourth sentences, as well as in section 3.5C, big I, final decision. Now, because those crucial terms are not defined in the law, and it's our job to define them for the purposes of the implementation of our code, I would hesitate to make any sweeping changes to our approval procedures unless we're otherwise directed by the OLCD in a rule. And I think there's a pretty simple way of making the required ministerial change of issuing an initial decision on an urban housing application without a hearing, without significantly changing our approval process. And I would be excited to talk about what that might look like if the commission's interested.
The red flag that comes up for me is how developers will feel that they're not. So what happens a lot now is people bring things before planning commission and they think they have some sort of semi-approval or initial decision, and then they go away. And if things aren't caught, they feel cheated and betrayed if they end up having to do more work than what they felt they had to do. And I'm sorry for not being clearer. I'm jealous of your ability to speak. So defining initial decision is important, I guess. I get it, because already I think that happens, is that there's pre-application process. People feel like if they say, whatever is said to them at a pre-application process is done, not an initial decision. Many see that as, if they follow all those things that came up, then they should pass go. And they don't necessarily. So it seems to make staff more vulnerable to being criticized for not catching everything. It's my concern.
I don't know if it's our role or within our purview to correct the ambiguity in the legislation, although I appreciate you raising it. I'm not sure what action we would take, to be honest with you. Maybe there is an action. I'm not asking for a response. But just to clarify, I think you mentioned that housing is not relevant to non-residential, but you can build multifamily housing and retail, commercial, employment with a special use, under special use standards. Is that correct, Brandon? You can build commercial, multifamily housing.
most of our,
And-
with the exception of industrial,
Right.
all of our commercial employees.
Right, so
And-
CFAs, multifamily, so I would say it does apply. I mean, I do agree
Any of
with you.
those containing residential would be considered an urban housing application and have to be a type 1.
Right, I got
Even
that
mixed use.
part.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I mean, I also think it's a further argument for option one. At least all the multifamily still is required to have type 2, is that correct?
Yeah, for
Is that
subdivisions.
non-residential zoning or non-residential building types?
It is residentially zoned or mixed use.
Okay,
So if you're subdividing something with the intention to create residential units, regardless of the zoning, it would be subject to a staff decision.
got it.
Susan?
Given that we do not have a PUD process, why would we do anything other than watch, wait, learn from, be informed by? But is there any requirement to do anything at this point in time?
I think as PUD is defined in law, our performance standard subdivision probably gets to that, creating multi-lot development with open space. And I think the plats that we typically are signing for a performance standard subdivision are PUD plats, even though we don't call it that. I think Medford is having that discussion. Can they just remove PUDs from their process and keep standard subdivisions and not have to worry about this? So that's something they're discussing with their city attorney right now.
I do think there's a value for our performance standard subdivisions and PUD or PSO in terms of allowing developments to consolidate housing in areas that are more readily developable and leaving areas that are steep or floodplain protected. So that's why it's embedded in our code, and I don't see a value in removing it in order to remove a application process
Yep.
concern.
PSO, it's really important to good development, and especially here. It creates better opportunities.
I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying this doesn't seem to apply literally, so why are we worrying about it? I mean, we can take the spirit of it and apply it to what we have.
PSO is a PUD, basically. They're just not called the same thing, but they operate the same way.
Yeah, it's like our code refers to accessory residential units, not accessory dwelling units. But I think the general expectation of a PSO is that it's processed like a PUD, and the plat that the surveyor has to prepare has the word plan unit development across the top of it when we sign those at the conclusion of a PSO subdivision as that state survey requirements.
Why wasn't it just called a PUD in the first place?
Because we're Ashland.
What's the staff's
Yeah,
recommendation?
I mean,
Sorry.
could I finish my thought? It just seems to me that largely similar. If the risk is that someone comes forward and says, no, you're not adhering to the new law because you don't have PUDs, is that actually a material risk? Or again, is this a circumstance where we can, again, I think our intent would be to operate to the spirit of things, but, rather than continuing to jury rig things that aren't quite the same, to give it a little bit more time to settle out rather than making changes while, re-engineering the plane while it's trying to fly.
So you're suggesting wait until the state has put together its draft ordinance?
Yeah, similar to the
guidance?
first one. I don't know why we would make changes like option one if we don't really need to.
I mean, I think on the staff side, we're assuming that largely similar is similar in everything but name, and that just saying it's not called the PUD isn't going to work.
Isn't
Happy
that
to-
a legal judgment, though?
It is. I don't believe that the state rulemaking process is going to address this question because they will come down and say that PUDs are processed in the following way. And so because Ashland is unique and referring to them as performance standards subdivisions or performance standards options, I do think it is a legal question as to whether that distinction could circumvent the intent of the state legislation. But from staff's perspective, we interpreted that the PUD process was referring to the process for performance standards options, where you have lots that aren't cookie cutter lots that all meet the dimensional requirements for the underlying zone, smaller lots, larger open space areas. So as such, as far as recommendations, I think option 1 is one to consider in terms of defining all urban housing applications can be processed through accelerated type 1 planning action for subdivisions. But again, council and planning commission's recommendation will dictate that final form.
I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting circumvention. I'm just, again, we've got, and, rebuilding the plane while it's flying.
Right.
And does that make sense to do? Maybe I'm missing something. Wouldn't be the first time.
I don't think you're missing anything. I think that legislation that would have directed LCDC to create rulemaking and a model ordinance prior to the mandated adoption period would have been preferable. Unfortunately, that's not the timeline that the legislature put forward. So here we are mid-flight.
Because we're kind of flying blind, and there is an expectation that we implement 974 somehow. It makes sense to me to consider this option 1 with respect to PSO subdivisions, retaining that distinction between residential and non-residential, but also clarifying the distinction between an initial and a final decision. Because if we assume that they're the same thing, that leads to the assumption, for which I see no authority in the law, of processing everything as a type 1. And I think it's possible to comply with the law by defining an initial decision as an administrative determination, as assumed, but putting forward the procedures or approval criteria of a final decision that's quite similar or indeed perhaps even identical to what we have now. Making that distinction is allowed by the law. And I see the logic of assuming that everything goes to type 1, but that assumption is predicated on 2 key operative terms that are not defined, that we can define. And I would be more comfortable with defining an initial decision as an administrative determination and then having 3 pathways that can result from that. One would be similar to the type 1 process that we have now, where it's presumptively not subject to hearing or appeal unless somebody asks for it. The second would be that the types of actions that currently trigger a type 2 hearing would continue to do so, and same with the type 3. And we get there just by defining initial decision and defining final decision differently, if that makes sense.
Okay.
doesn't that basically circumvent the goal of 974?
Well, the OLCD can make a rule saying that it does, but until they do, it's up to us to interpret that law. And I am hesitant to make any significant change to our land use ordinance.
Until we
Until
know
we're
what's going on.
directed to.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I love it, but I'm just like,
My preference would be to make the minimum change possible to comply with the law. And it appears to me that a ministerial change that defines an initial decision and defines a final decision as something else would get there.
so are you, Brandon and Derek, are you getting some direction from us in all of this?
Well, not from the body as a whole. I'd say, the discussion is interesting. I would note that our land use code currently does have sections for type 2 procedures that refer to the planning hearing as the first hearing, and then it goes on to stipulate that the final decision, if submitted upon appeal to council, that council makes the final decision. But I think that Commissioner Liniger is correct that there isn't a term initial decision in our code. It only refers to it being the type 2 decisions are made by the Planning Commission after a public hearing with an opportunity to appeal to City Council. So we've always assumed that the initial decision was the decision of the first body that then could be appealed for a final decision to the second. So if it's a staff decision, that would be the initial appealable to the Planning Commission for the final decision of the city.
Which is what 974 is saying, is like if it gets appealed, then it comes back could come back to Planning Commission.
Correct.
So it
but
doesn't change
and
anything.
correct me if I'm wrong, I think Commissioner Liniger is referring to that you could have the initial decision defined as before the Planning Commission without a hearing. And so that would be a opportunity for this body to make that initial decision, but not permit anybody to speak to the application, including applicants, opponents, which would be different than our normal process.
It would be somewhat different in that we have to comply with section 3.7 as it's written, right? So the initial decision has to occur without a hearing. What's the initial decision is the operative question. What I propose is to say that the initial decision is the determination of the city administration that an application should proceed. And that initial decision would be subject to review of the appropriate body, whether it be the Planning Commission or whether it be the council, or whether, as in a type 1 situation, that it's just presumptively final.
So I question whether that's a decision then that staff is making to forward an application that it's ready. We already make a determination of completeness on an application to bring it forth to the body for a public hearing, but that is not a decision of staff to approve, deny, or amend with condition.
So this goes back to my initial question. What in the Oregon Revised Statutes defines the decision?
And that I think we need to look a little further, because I do think talking about limited land use decisions, I am sure that it speaks to final decision of the city as a decision on appeal, which is then subject to appeal to LUBA. I just don't know off the top of my head if initial decision is clearly defined.
Don't think it's safe to assume that a decision is yes or no? That's the decision, approved or not approved?
Well, it could be approved with conditions.
Well, fair enough.
That's so sad.
I'm sorry to make it so esoteric, but I really did search in good faith, our code and the statutes to try to figure out what the answers were. And this is just like, this is a point of huge ambiguity with respect to the implementation of 974.
So do you have some direction to go back and do some research?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can definitely come back with some. ideas and research off of that.
Okay, let's move on to.
Chair Werner? I'm sorry, Commissioner Phillips would like to
Sorry,
jump
Russell.
in.
Russell, you
Oh,
want
thanks, guys. Thanks, Chair Werner. Really been enjoying listening to the conversation and all the input from the commissioners on this. And just briefly, again, my position would be to go with the intent of 974 and move to allow the residential PSO subdivisions for administrative decision. It would make sense to have a clear comment period with a potential appeal to the planning commission. And, I would also suggest that we make the performance standard subdivision options criteria as clear and as objective as possible. And I think that might help to address some of the potential issues that commissioners were talking about.
Susan, go ahead.
What I don't understand and have not heard, I think an argument for is why we would differentiate commercial projects and subject them to a more rigorous process. Why do that in option one?
For a commercial subdivision, and we don't see a lot of them, but you could have increased traffic impacts, which may be something to be evaluated as part of a broader application. I think they could be combined in all type 1 applications. A commercial subdivision that included site review for the development itself would still be subject to come before the Planning Commission as a type 2 action. And the recent subdivisions that were commercial that we saw combined both the buildings and lots simultaneously. So they wouldn't qualify as just a straight commercial subdivision of just lots for sale. Derek, do you have?
The only thing, I think it's rare under our current process for someone to use performance standards for commercial because they don't have the same lot width and depth requirements that residential does. We've seen it only a couple times in the 30 years I've been here. So typically people use that cookie cutter subdivision process that lets them circumvent the two-tier process of performance standards because they can get away with it in a commercial zone without typically having to worry about protecting, significant trees and wanting to cluster housing somewhere. But it has happened a few times. And I do think that's why we put that second option there is, do you really want to have, a 3-lot commercial subdivision triggering a public hearing and a 100-lot residential subdivision being a staff decision?
It just seems to me, given that it's a rare case, given that this is a city that I think it arguably has a bad reputation for being business friendly, that anything that would make it harder for the rare case to happen, why do that? Would be my position. I mean, the market will basically, for the most part, guide where developers decide to invest in, whether it's commercial or part commercial, and maybe lofts upstairs if the offices don't get occupied, that, it would just take care of things without, creating further complexity or, again, the reputation of Ashland is unfriendly to business when we need business. In my humble opinion.
Okay,
Okay.
let's move on.
Okay, the last issue is variances and exceptions. And I'm not really considering exceptions here because all of our exception processes are by code type 1. Although you often see them as part of a public hearing, if they were being considered on their own, the exceptions are all considered type 1 procedures. So currently, we process variances on the specific details of the request, with some subject to staff approval and some requiring a hearing before the commission. And that, the magnitude of a setback, the magnitude of an increase in height, those type of things. So the options really would be to look at meeting that urban housing definition and saying anything that qualifies as an urban housing application would be a type 1, and all the other variances would remain as is, or look at some variation of either making all of them a type 1 period, or looking more closely at the type 1 and type 2 distinctions. And where that could come into play is Senate Bill 1537, which has some, in addition to exceptions and variances, Senate Bill 1537 introduced some adjustments which are to be processed in a process very similar to a type 1 to get around the flexibility of, or the difficulty in obtaining a variance. So they've added another layer of process, and if you ask for an adjustment under 1537, it's essentially a type 1 staff procedure, and it has different thresholds than our type 1 and type 2. So someone might choose not to apply for a type 2 application and instead go through a type 1 process under 1537 in order to get around our hearing process. We could look at those thresholds in 1537 and see if they merit adjustment to more closely align the procedures. And 1537 is one that is subject to sunset, so the state has suggested that we not adopt our own codes for it and implement directly from the state law. So there's a type 1, a type 2, and a third tier of procedure out there called something else, but basically with a type 1 procedure and different thresholds. And we could try to make that a little more consistent. Or we could just do the minimum necessary and define a urban housing application and stop there.
When does
So-
1537 sunset?
I want to say 2032.
That's 1 year before Section 8 of 947.
Yeah, for
sunsets,
some reason-
Which also has to do with variances.
Yeah.
So variances are supposed to be difficult to get. So the idea of making them easier doesn't sit well with me. Right, yeah, so everybody can get them. And that doesn't, to me, that just doesn't make any sense. So I think it would behoove us to have you do the research to figure out how to make 1537 work with our current procedures. Does that make sense?
When you say work with our current procedures, you mean come back to you essentially and explain where we could make changes, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
that would not take away the whole reason for a variance procedure, which is to grant something that you don't want to be easy.
Yeah. And I think 1537 to some extent does that, because it basically brings not only a lesser procedure, but it puts specific criteria. Although the criteria largely look for someone to make affordable housing as one of the key justifications. And if you're committing to doing affordable housing, you're subject to a certain exception or adjustment. But those criteria are not, if you're not willing to do affordable housing or something like that, they're not that much easier than a variance.
Okay.
One note, and Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, I think affordable housing is one justification. Another justification under 1537 is if you can demonstrate that without merit of the exception to something like lot coverage or setbacks, that you would not be able to accommodate the number of housing units that you're proposing, whether or not they're affordable.
Yeah.
So it's not specifically about affordability. It actually is, so if you needed to go to 60% lot coverage instead of 50 in order to do 3 units, and otherwise you could only do 2, that would be a justification to automatically grant the variance to lot coverage under 1537. Is that,
Okay, that makes no sense either, because,
it's, the 1537 enumerates a number of changes to setbacks, height, lot coverage, some site design and use standards.
And I think it also says if, not just more units, but if you can demonstrate, it'll make them more affordable. Not affordable, but more affordable.
it would make more sense to be talking about variances if there was a requirement for affordability included in the units. But just to say, anybody who wants to propose 5 units or 10 units of any kind of housing, they can get this variance/exception.
Yeah, my understanding is the legislative intent was to address the statewide housing crisis and promote more housing units in short order, which is why it was allowed for a discrete period of time to sunset, not as a permanent change. However, this 974 does, if you codify it in your local ordinance, then effectively becomes permanent unless you modify that ordinance after
10
974
years.
sunsets.
Yeah.
So,
Susan?
But to your point on intent, it seems like this is an opportunity ripe for losing the forest for the trees. You know, this word, that word, this regulation, that regulation, and therefore, I do think that your, research and consideration, yes, we need to act on a timely manner, but make sure that, because that the intent is what we continue to work towards, not manipulating, as is to create a 2B that somehow misses the goal. And
changes the whole character of the town.
yeah, yeah, accidentally.
Certainly
So-
not deliberately. John?
Well, I just add that, to be fair, 1537 is going to add more units. It's going to help, it will help to address how much, hard to say, but it will help to address by increasing density, exactly what you said, and incentivizing developers to provide more units in a project that otherwise might not support them financially. So, I think that's good for Ashland. I think it's good for Jackson County.
Do you have enough to go do?
If we're ready to move on. The last piece is really, the last piece got away from me. So the last piece is the issue of regulating site design review for 20-plus unit residential developments. And it essentially says we can't apply certain design standards to 1 and 2 family dwellings in projects that are 20 or more units. Since we don't have a site review process now that applies to 1 and 2 family dwellings, this really doesn't affect us except for the fact that I think in 1825090, we do have some standards that are specific to single family and duplexes. And we also have some design standards in the North Mountain Neighborhood Plan that we'll need to look at and probably qualify that they don't apply in developments of more than 20 units. So I'm not really looking for an option here, just to make you aware that we're going to have to come back with some tweaks to those sections just to address these specifics of 974.
Okay,
But it won't be a big procedural change because they're not projects that are subject to site review and our site design standards now.
okay.
So again, I think as we've mentioned, the intent under 974 is that we make these changes by July 1st, and we're intent upon doing that even as time gets close. And I think the key is probably going to be clearly defining urban housing applications in 18.6. And then it may be as simple as in our procedures chapter, just having notes that in any application that qualifies as an urban housing application for zone changes or not, variances and PSO subdivisions, that they're a type 1, and that doesn't require a lot of rewriting. We could do it fairly simply if we don't want to get into more cleanup. So that's all I've got.
Okay, so, my understanding is that there are some cleanup issues that you guys have sort of waiting. Do you want to do those at the same time?
I think those are, I'll let Brandon speak, but I think they're probably bigger than,
Yeah, I think we have a series of what I'd call house cleaning, as well as some that have substantive policy issues that should be all bundled and come forward in a packet distinct from 974.
Okay,
I think they might get convoluted if we were trying to present issues with modifying our tree ordinance and stuff like that
okay,
with these provisions.
okay,
With the exceptions of those that directly relate, like subdivision, final outline, plan, size, 10 or 12 units. It seems now might be an opportune time to incorporate that one.
okay.
So one other thing I'd say and follow up to Derek's conclusionary statements there in terms of defining urban housing application. If in our code we clarify that, consistent with the ORS, then as the model code comes forth at the beginning of next year, we'll be in a position to yet again open up our code and go back and ensure that it addresses the model code language. As much as I'd like to be completed at this stage, I do anticipate that in February or March of next year, the state will have a model code that provides that clarity that we're lacking right now. We can.
And we can have this conversation all over again. Gosh, how fun.
Sorry.
Okay, so I think we're done with this issue.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to move on to open discussion. That's to say that I gave you so when we make decisions, I hear you guys talking about how to make a motion, how to, what do you say, what do you include, blah, blah, blah. So I put down here my best intent about what to include and how to make a motion and content, and then I was using an example from a couple weeks ago. We can discuss it tonight, we can wait until Derek makes it pretty next time, whatever your pleasure is. But the intent is to give you some guidelines on what needs to go into a motion when we're approving or denying something. And Russell, I'll email it to you, or I'll email it to Brandon, and he'll email it to you.
Russell's a
the other
master
thi-
at making motions.
The other thing that Chair Werner had discussed with staff was having us bring back, when we bring a staff report to you, bring a clear recommended motion that addresses all these points. So your last slide can be on the screen and give you some guidance that way.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful as well, so.
And Russell doesn't need to write them.
We'll be asking for those.
Okay, is there any interest in discussing how to make a motion at this point, or would somebody like to make a motion to adjourn? Neither?
I move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.